and welcome to the Notre Dame Forum. My name is Scott Appleby, and I'm the Marilyn Keough Dean of the Donald R. Keough School of Global Affairs, which opened the doors of Jenkins Hall to the first class of Masters of Global Affairs students this August. The Keough School is new, the magnificent Jenkins and Nanovic halls are new, and the master's program is brand new. Notre Dame International, now in its 7th year of expanding, coordinating, and overseeing Notre Dame study abroad programs, global gateways, and other new student and faculty research centers and sites around the world, is now directed by an outstanding new leader, Michael Pippinger. Indeed, I'm the only thing in this opening that is not new. These new developments at Notre Dame are part of the reason why the theme of this year's forum is Going Global. The larger context is the rapidly changing international and global landscape and the attempt of the leading institutions of higher education to keep pace. Thus, in the year 2010, the university embarked on an ambitious plan to deepen Notre Dame's international profile and character. In this effort, all the colleges and schools at Notre Dame seek to further internationalize the curriculum, the student body, and the faculty to extend our institutional, scholarly, and educational presence around the world, and to deepen understanding of foreign cultures and societies while being attentive to America's changing role in global affairs. In these and many other ways, Notre Dame will prepare students for the transnational professional careers and vocations of the globalized 21st century. But what does globalization mean today? After an initial period of optimism about the prospect of greater prosperity and progress that would seem to accompany open borders, free trade, the spread of democracy, and the leveling dynamism of new technologies of communications and data sharing, we are newly aware of the widening gap between rich and poor, the persistence of conflict, epidemics, political authoritarianism, and of what Pope Francis has called the globalization of indifference. At the same time, our government and elected officials face a demand for greater accountability to the people. In this context, we must subject proposed laws and policies to rigorous analysis, identify the role of government in advancing human flourishing, and ask how civil society and Catholic institutions, including Notre Dame, can contribute to the common good. To this end, the 2017-18 Notre Dame Forum explores the challenges and opportunities posed by globalization. Through a series of debates and discussions, we will encourage sustained reflection on how faculty, staff, and students can incorporate a morally grounded global awareness into our research, teaching, practice, and service. All are encouraged to consider how to engage with the forum topic and extend the dialogue to the classroom, lab, studio, and workplace. Such participation can transform the forum from a series of events like the one tonight into a true campus-wide conversation. The person behind the Notre Dame Forum and behind the effort to transform Our Lady's University into a truly global educational institution and moral presence is the 17th president of the University of Notre Dame, Reverend John Jenkins, CSC. Please join me in welcoming Father John, who will introduce our distinguished panelist and moderator.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank all of you for being with us tonight. As Scott said, the theme of the Notre Dame Forum this year is Going Global, exploring the challenges and opportunities of globalization. We begin what will be a year-long dialogue about the many dimensions of globalization with tonight's conversation, Views from the West Wing. We will consider tonight how presidential decisions and U.S. foreign policy shape and are shaped by global trends and patterns, as well as by those more immediate crises and opportunities presented by the events unfolding every day. In this discussion, it is a true privilege to be joined by two extraordinary public servants, Andrew Card and Denis McDonough. I will share with you only a few excerpts from their very impressive biographies. George W. Bush's first chief of staff, Andy Card, served 5 years and 3 months. This is the longest term of service in this highly influential post in the modern era. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, it was Andy Card who whispered in President Bush's ear that America was under attack. From 2011 to 2014, Card served as acting dean at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University and as executive director of the Office of the Provost. He was appointed president of Franklin Pierce University in Rindge, New Hampshire in 2014, serving until his retirement year. As President Obama's final chief from February 2013 until January 20th, 2017, Denis McDonough provided strategic advice to the president on the most significant issues of domestic policy, national security, and management issues facing the federal government. He enforced plans on accountability for performance and goals, maintaining the Obama administration's reputation for effective ethical operations. And at a polarized town, at a polarized time, he is one of the few people who is spoken very well of by both sides of the aisle. Since leaving the White House in January, McDonough has worked as senior principal for the Markle Foundation, an organization that seeks to boost employment opportunities and expand job training. He is also a visiting senior fellow at the Technology and International Affairs program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. However, most importantly, he now teaches in the Keough School's Global Policy Initiative, where he serves as executive fellow. Chris Whipple, the author of the recent book, The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency, writes, quote, "These are the men who make the difference between success and disaster for every presidency." A reviewer of that book wrote, quote, "The media obsessively scrutinized the records of key presidential appointees, including cabinet secretaries, Supreme Court justices, and ambassadors. Yet, ironically, the appointment most critical to the success of a president, the chief of staff, requires no Senate confirmation and receives little public publicity." As James A. Baker has said, the White House chief of staff holds the second most powerful job in government. Every president learns, often the hard way, that he cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief of staff to execute his agenda and often to tell him what he does not want to hear. He or she is the president's most powerful advisor and closest confidant. We are delighted and grateful that these two distinguished patriots are here with us tonight to share their knowledge, experience, and insight. And I turn now the proceedings over to our moderator, Maura Policelli. Maura is Executive Director of the Keough School's Global Policy Initiative. Before coming to Notre Dame, Policelli served as Chief of Staff for Oxfam America and recently held that same position for two members of Congress, Jane Harman and Gabrielle Giffords. Maura, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Father John, and welcome everyone. I'm honored to share the stage with both of you this evening, and thank you for your contributions to our nation throughout your extraordinary careers in public service. Having been a Chief of Staff to members of Congress, I have some sense of the position each of you held in the White House. However, not many jobs involve issues that span the country and the globe and impact millions of Americans. You were each the closest advisor to the most powerful individual in the world. In fact, your job was to stay one step ahead of the most powerful individual in the world, to get up earlier, stay up later, to read every briefing memo on dozens of issues, and then decide which ones the president would get. To deliver good news and bad, tragically Andy knows that all too well, and to simultaneously formulate policy recommendations and political judgments. And this all happened fast. The White House is nonstop. That is why presidents end up having multiple chiefs of staff. The job is relentless. The White House Chief of Staff must function as a gatekeeper, a confidant, power broker, negotiator, media strategist. So to begin with you, Andy, which one of these roles or others did you find most effective in advising President Bush?
The greatest challenge for a Chief of Staff is the care and feeding of the President. And you should all want to be the President because you're very well cared for. But seriously, the responsibility of a Chief of Staff is to make sure the President is available to make a brutally tough decision at any time during any day, which means you don't want the President worrying about the little things. You want him focusing on the constitutional responsibilities of paying attention to all of us and to ultimately preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And so the greatest challenge is actually making sure the President is in a good mood, that you understand the burden that he's carrying, whether it be the burden of work or the burden of caring about his friends or his family. And so I was always looking for the President to be in a good mood because I never wanted the President to make a decision when he was in a bad mood. And I wanted him to come to work greeted with optimism and excitement and responsibility. So setting the stage for the President to make presidential decisions was the biggest part of the job. But you should understand part of that responsibility is to make sure the President never makes an easy decision. Because if they've made an easy decision, they've wasted their time, and time is very precious because there aren't that many days of a presidency. And presidents want to get a lot done, and then they have to do even more because what they want to do sometimes gets crowded out with what they need to do, and you want to make sure the President's in a good frame of mind to do that.
Well, it's hard to add much to what Andy said. I will say that staying one step ahead of the President requires orchestrating an effective staff, identifying, hiring, and making sure that that team is operating in an atmosphere and with structures and processes that are clear, that are straightforward, that are governed by respect and civility, so that these extraordinarily difficult decisions that Andy talks about and that you can all imagine come to him in a fashion that ensures he's got all the information he can have to make a sound decision. And so the job of the Chief of Staff is to, as Andy said, ensure the care and feeding of the President, but also then to ensure the effective functioning of a White House staff and of a cabinet to the President of the United States that includes thousands of people. And you won't be able to do that if you don't have a team that feels that you treat them with respect, that you run a fair and orderly process to allow them to get the President the information that he needs to cover that kind of ground that you've just laid out.
So how would President Obama make decisions, or how would you pull together the right team or advisors to help him make what most likely was the tough decision beyond the ones you had already made?
Well, it's important, I think, when you enter into a building like that, much like I think when you enter a campus like this, that you recognize that practices and policies and procedures have built up over time based on experience from a lot of interesting and smart people that have come before you. So not only did I reach out to people like Andy, who had done the job before us, but I'd also talked to all the living chiefs of staff to get their advice. And the most important process to ensure the president could make his decision in a sound fashion was to rely on the institutions that have grown up inside the White House. The National Security Council, which is the president's closest advisors on national security policies. The Domestic Policy Council, same thing on domestic policies. And then the National Economic Council. All of that work is overseen importantly by a very important function inside the White House, which is called the staff secretary, which is somebody who will ensure that every piece of paper that comes to the president is prepared for him in a fair and transparent way, so that he has the information that he needs, as we said, to make those decisions. Then the president sometimes makes a decision over the course of many days, even over the course of many weeks, as you're developing and feeding those options to him. But the world being what it is, oftentimes, as Andy's alluded to, he's going to have to make those decisions over the course of hours, sometimes in the dead of night. And if you're not running a clean process to ensure that people are prepared to get those decisions to the president in a well-shaped up manner, then they're going to end up being bad decisions. So the most important thing, as Andy said, is make sure you're sensitive to the president's time. Don't overload him with decisions he doesn't need to make. But the decisions he does need to make, give him the information he needs.
So in terms of the competing priorities, Andy, you served at the beginning of President Bush's 2 terms, and Dennis, you were in the 2nd term for President Obama. So in both contexts, you have the overarching re-election, in your case, Andy, that is always out there, driving your desire to have an agenda, have accomplishments. And then, of course, there's the desire for a legacy, which drives the 2nd term of presidents to really get to the finish line on key priorities. So, Andy, how do you find that balance? And obviously, you had an extraordinary start to President Bush's presidency with 9/11, but those tensions are always there. So how did you balance those?
Well, it starts with people. You have to have good people serving the president, people that he has great confidence in. The vast majority of people who work for the president are really outstanding people, and they're hired because they have phenomenal tunnel vision and expertise. And the chief of staff's job is to manage those people so that they don't abuse the president and abuse the process. And that relates to any area of policy, but it also relates to the relationship between the presidency and a candidacy for the presidency or re-election. So I would compartmentalize the White House staff. And by the way, I would draw upon a lot of Notre Dame alumni. Condi Rice would be right at the top of the list, but the fellow by the name of Phil Brady. And there were many people that were outstanding in what they knew, but my job was to make sure their tunnel vision wasn't used without the context of peripheral vision. And that applied to running the government, and it also applies to running the campaign. It's especially critical when you're involved in a re-election campaign because you don't want running the government to look inconsistent with what is happening with the campaign and vice versa. So I would say the chief of staff's job, among other things, is to have very good peripheral vision, understand what's happening in the environment around the White House, Washington, D.C., the nation, and the world, as you're considering the outstanding recommendations from these people who have phenomenal tunnel vision. But if their tunnel vision is inconsistent with what the expectations are outside, you don't necessarily serve the president well, and you may cost him re-election. So balancing that, I think, was a critically important aspect.
I'll put our Notre Dame alums up against that illustrious group. We had Rob Neighbors and Katie Byrne, now Katie Byrne Fallon, at the table. In fact, it was unspoken rule that there had to be at least one Notre Dame alum at the morning, the morning meeting. So, in a lot of different ways, I had it much easier than Andy, to include the fact that he served for more than 5 years in this very difficult job. And in many ways, it's legendary. We all think that about Andy's service. But serving in the second term, you're freed up from that extreme pressure to get to re-election. And it's not that as soon as you're re-elected, Andy obviously experienced that too, that all of a sudden you're focused on legacy. The overwhelming feeling you have in the second term is a sense of shortness of time. The irony is that since you've been there a full term already, you don't feel an ability to coast. You actually understand how quickly 4 years can go. You'll feel that after your time is done here at Notre Dame, and you'll look back and wonder how it went so quickly. When you have a president with a very full agenda and you have a country with a range of challenges and opportunities, you feel an extraordinary burden of short time to get it done in. And so not only does that require you then to have the peripheral vision that Andy is talking about, but it also requires you to have a focus on the strategic, to not be driven solely by your inbox, but be driven by both the president's agenda, the country's needs, and the opportunities that present themselves along the way. And if you can match that peripheral vision with an ability to also then see out over the horizon, then you can do it. The problem is, in this job, like a lot of life, you don't get to set your own course because there's a lot of incoming along the way. We've witnessed that just in the last couple of months here in our country, but throughout our time in government, I'm sure Andy could list the same amount of things, starting obviously with 9/11, that end up really taking over a president's agenda.
Mm-hmm. So one obstacle, of course, along the way, or maybe not obstacle, we have Congress.
Yes, we do.
With approval ratings of
Do we?
probably 9% right now. But the founders wanted the balance of power, so here we are, and in theory it works. But it occurs to me that on one critical issue of the use of force, both administrations you served in had to decide how, if, when to engage Congress. And of course, in leading up to the Iraq War, I was on the House in the House at the time, so I have that vantage point. But for you, Andy, in terms of the Iraq War decision and the engagement of Congress in that case, and then Dennis with the red line in Syria and the discussions in Congress at the time, and then also with the fight against ISIS and to engage Congress or not, and the various opinions on the Hill. So if you could both comment on those two specific
Well, I think you were involved in
experiences.
one of those aspects. You were on the receiving end, working up in Congress. So it was literally almost this time of year in 2002 when President Bush had come off of a speech at the United Nations in early September where he challenged the United Nations to hold Saddam Hussein accountable for not complying with 16 resolutions. And after President Bush delivered that very powerful speech in New York City at the United Nations, there was a healthy debate within the White House as to whether or not the president should ask Congress for authority to use force to go into Iraq. And he made the decision that he would do it, even though every president feels they really don't have to, and that's a constitutional question. But rather than go to the Supreme Court, they decide to comply, or at least try to comply. And I do remember there was a bipartisan effort, and if I remember correctly, I think Senator Daschle was a co-sponsor, and we were able to get the authorization to use force in Iraq passed in the Senate on a vote. I think there were 73 favorable votes if my memory serves me right. And it also passed the House with about 260 or 70 votes. And it was a bipartisan effort that had some strong opposition, but the opposition didn't even come close to a majority. So it wasn't as a difficult a task as it appears that it would have been at the time. It was important for the president to get that vote of confidence because he had asked other nations to step up in his speech at the United Nations. So that October vote, and I think it was, if my memory serves me right, I think it was October 14th of 2002, when the House and Senate presented a bill to the president, which he signed, allowing him to use force to wrest Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. And it was a very dramatic action by Congress, and it led to very dramatic actions on the ground. I can tell you that the president was hoping that he did not have to use force, because at the same time he was working very hard to try to find a diplomatic solution with many of our allies, and we were giving Saddam Hussein lots of time to comply with the UN resolutions. But as you know, he did not, and he did not succumb to the invitations to find a compromise with others intervening, particularly the Egyptians were trying to wrest him from power in a friendly way, and we ended up going into war. That's another whole story, but getting Congress to approve not a declaration of war, but a use of force permission is not an easy task to ask for, and it's not an easy task to accomplish. President Bush did it with relatively broad bipartisan support.
So it's not easy to get, and it's remarkable that the Bush administration got two of them, one after 9/11, and then another one related to Iraq about a year later. And my belief is, as I think Andy is saying, that it's difficult to get, but it's important to get. And it's important to get because the Constitution calls for it.
Debatable.
Debatable. Here's my view, Andy, and I've been teaching this all week, so please don't undercut me. I'm sorry, was the mic live? Article 1 lists powers of the Congress. Mistake to put Congress first, but they did it. Section 9 says Congress makes and raises armies, makes and raises the Navy, and declares war. Article 2, Section 8, says the President's Commander-in-Chief. So both bodies have very important roles to play in the conduct of military action. I believe that the founders challenged both bodies to do that, because on a decision as important as the use of force in deploying our people overseas, the country deserves to see a united leadership on questions of that gravity and import. And so they tried to lay out a playbook that demands that we do that. Consistent with the importance of that function, it's difficult to get. And I'm here to tell you that it's really difficult to get because we tried around Syria. There's been a lot of focus on the question of the red line in Syria, and I'll talk about that in a second. But after initially reaching out to Congress to seek congressional support for a vote similar to the one in Iraq and Afghanistan, initially Congress was very much for it, Republicans and Democrats, and said as much to the president in private and to the press in public. But it quickly became very unpopular. So Congress backed way away from the decision to consider an authorization to use force. Importantly, the fact that the president had put out a credible threat of force, including a credible enough threat that he went to Congress to ask for their help, and mindful of what we had done both under the Bush administration, but then importantly throughout the Obama years, that credible threat of force, verbalized in the red line that the president stated, ended up helping us fulfill an objective that we had sought for a long time in Syria. Because you'll recall, until September 2013, Syria had neither acknowledged the existence of a chemical weapons program, nor offered to give it up. Under the credible threat of military force that the president announced during August and September of 2013, Russia pressured the Assad regime in Syria to, for the first time, acknowledge the existence of that chemical stockpile, then to give up the guts of the program that made the chemicals, verified by the international community, and the vast majority of the makeup of that arsenal. If the president had used force before all of that stuff was moved out of Syria, I think the president rightly feared, that the chemical weapons on the ground in Syria would have been dispersed and proliferated among very hateful, violent organizations, including ISIL. That would have made an extraordinarily gruesome civil war that much more gruesome. So not only is the call in the Constitution to struggle over these issues important because it sends an important message to the American people that we're united when we take these difficult steps, but it also sends an important message to our adversaries that we're serious about the use of these things. So it turns out there's a lot of logic and sound thinking behind that document going back a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm. One other example, staying on this topic for a moment, of use of force or national security issues that both of you bookend, at least for a chapter, on the war on terror, which began, we can, I think, assume or show after 9/11, and then, of course, continued into the Obama administration. So looking at the evolution of the U.S. policy on this war on terror, I'd like both of you to comment on the most controversial parts of how your administrations executed that war. Under the Bush administration, it was enhanced interrogations, and then under the Obama administration, the use of drones has received a lot of scrutiny and criticism. So if you could each just comment on those specific policies.
Well, first I'll start off with the war on terror did begin on September 11th, 2001. And the unusual aspect of this war, it wasn't against a nation state. So there was a constitutional question. We weren't declaring war on another state. It was terrorists and terrorism. And so there was no textbook to follow or no law to follow. The closest thing that came to it was fighting the pirates, maybe in the early 1800s. So that was different. The president made a decision to go to Congress, and Congress passed overwhelmingly authorization to use force in fighting terrorism, and it passed and became law on September 14th, 2001, only 3 days after the attacks, which was pretty remarkable. And it did give the president very broad authority. By the way, that very same authority was used by President Obama, and it's being used by President Trump today. So it has been a lasting legacy. I'm not sure it's an exciting legacy of the past, but it's a lasting legacy of Congress and the executive branch finding a common enemy and giving common authorization to fight it. In the context of September 11, 2001, and most of you in the audience were very young when it happened and don't remember. Those of us who are on stage and some of the people in the balconies remembered it, and we promised we'd never forget. And it did change the world. That day changed the world. And it changed the world in so many different ways. But it did impact the presidency, which means it impacted President Bush and his successors. It's impacted Obama, and it's impacting Trump. And that is the president has, number one, the authority to use force if he chooses to under that provision. Number two, he has the obligation under his oath to preserve, protect, and defend us. And that's a terrible burden to carry, because that burden doesn't call for anyone's permission. They don't get permission from Congress to meet the burden. They don't get the permission from the United Nations. They don't get the permission from the French. Even the French don't give them permission. They carry that burden. And I'm a witness to how significant that burden is, and it gets to the question of enhanced interrogation techniques. I remember vividly when we had intelligence that Abu Zubaydah was someone that was planning bad things and had talked about doing bad things and was very involved, and we got word that we knew where he was and what he was doing, and we could go and try to get him. And we actually went in a big firefight in Pakistan, caught Abu Zubaydah, and brought him to justice. He was very badly injured. We sent over a doctor from Johns Hopkins to make sure that he would be saved, because we thought that he had a lot of information. And he was a very tough person and was resistant to the normal techniques of interrogation that are used under the Defense Department rules. And he was not being responsive, and yet all of our intelligence analysts and experts felt that he had a lot more information to give us. And there was a credible expectation there was an attack that had been planned and would be soon executed in the United States in a very major city. And there was great fear. And I remember when our CIA Director, George Tenet, came in and described the situation and the challenge that we had, and President Bush decided that, number one, he wanted someone to find out what legal authorities he had to do, so he tasked a number of lawyers inside the White House, inside the CIA, inside the Justice Department, to give him a reading of his legal authority. The CIA did an awful lot of work addressing the legal authority. The general counsel was a fellow by the name of John Rizzo. And they did an awful lot of work, and they also met with experts in interrogation and presented the president with some options that he should consider. And this was not something that the president delegated to anybody else. He accepted the responsibility. And the lawyers came back and gave him parameters. He then met with the intelligence community, and they gave him parameters, and they said how critically important it was and how time was critically important. And the president reviewed a list of enhanced interrogation techniques which the lawyers had said would not conflict with our international obligations in our current law, and also meet the obligations that the medical community had in terms of what techniques could be used. The president did not embrace every technique that had been recommended. I think there were two that he dismissed and said that he would not do. But he did reluctantly authorize the CIA to conduct interrogation. And interrogation is not something that the CIA normally did. It was normally done by the FBI. So this was kind of a break with traditions. We all kind of think from television that the CIA does all these interrogations. They really didn't do very much of that before. It was usually done by the FBI. The FBI was not able to get the results they wanted. So the bottom line is a very tough decision was made to use these enhanced techniques. If you read President Bush's book, or Alberto Gonzalez's book, or John Rizzo's commentaries, you'll find that we do feel that the techniques did produce results that allowed us to, number one, catch Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, identify where he was, what aliases he'd used, and how to get him, and that was critically important, and others. But it also helped for us to discover some of the attacks that had been planned on the United States and give some means of interrupting those so that they didn't happen. Very controversial. It's still controversial. It should be controversial, and the president knew that it would be controversial when he approved it, but it was something that he had to do, and I think he did that under his authority as Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States, and his obligation to preserve and protect us.
So speaking of controversy, and we'll get back to drones at some point, I'm sure, this evening, before we go on to inviting some students up for questions, How is the current White House doing?
I'm the Republican on the stage. I have had a rule that I've tried to impose on people who worked at the White House and suggest to people who run to be president, and I've actually suggested it to sitting presidents, sometimes much to my chagrin, but anyway, I've done it. And the rule is a simple one: taste your words before you spit them out. And the words that a president uses are very, very significant. They impact a White House staff, they impact an executive bureaucracy, they create a climate that Congress then has to consider. They motivate people, they generate emotions, and they sometimes call others to action. So I think it's very critical that a president be very careful with the words they use, and to the best of their ability, not be impulsive. And so I find that one of the challenges for the White House today is not necessarily a president who tweets, but it's a world that responds to tweets. If a president tweeted and only sent it to the staff secretary, I would be glad that he tweeted. Unfortunately, he doesn't send it just to the staff secretary, and he reaches around everyone else, and the tweets do motivate us, create emotions, and cause people to have high expectations or low expectations, or just an emotion. And emotions is something that government usually tries not to make decisions around. They try to make decisions exercising judgment and wisdom. So I give the White House poor marks for discipline with words. I give them high marks for internal discipline about serving the president. And I think General John Kelly, as Chief of Staff, and even his predecessor, Reince Priebus, did a pretty good job of creating a White House that, number one, allowed the president to travel without losing his luggage and those kinds of things. So there's an organization that counts. I think General Kelly has done an even better job of bringing discipline to how the White House does their job for the president. But I'm not sure the discipline has extended into the Oval Office the way it should. And General Kelly, I'm sure, is working hard to introduce that discipline, but it comes from the top. It doesn't come from the bottom. So I give the White House high marks for organizational discipline. I give them relatively, well, they're getting improvement in their policy discipline, and the role of policy discipline is less about the policy and more about the consequence of policy. So I'm a big believer in having a process around policy that is very disciplined so that people can discuss all of the consequences of policy so that we don't have very many unintended consequences when the policy is in place. And that discipline appears to be coming into the White House because I think General Kelly understands that. And I'm going to give them an A for improved effort. I'm not going to give them an A for performance yet, but I want the president to succeed. Some of you may be cynical about President Obama's ability to lead this country. I ask you, don't be cynical. It's okay to be skeptical, but don't be cynical. If you're a cynic, you're not helping to solve the problem. If you're a skeptic, you're at least inviting someone to pay attention to you so they might learn. So I'm going to say I really want him to succeed, and I hope that he will find the discipline to do it well.
Here. It's hard to add to that, and I agree with everything that Andy said. And I know John Kelly a little bit. I have a lot of admiration for him. We work together on a lot of very difficult things. And it's hard to imagine someone who's given more to this country. His own service, obviously, and his having lost his son in Iraq many years ago. So, actually not that many years ago. So I have a lot of admiration for John, and I think he deserves the remarks and the observations that Andy's made. One of the things that used to drive me crazy, though, inside the White House is the commentary on how things get done and less focused on what gets done. And so I hope that, or ultimately, I will reserve my judgments based on what I see in terms of results. And on that, I think there's enough to be concerned about, that I worry about when I see, as I watch, that I want, as Andy said, the President and John Kelly to succeed, because I think I want to make sure that the country succeeds. And if we continue on a path, for example, on things related to climate change or North Korea, there's real risks that we don't. And that's ultimately detrimental to the national interest. So I want to see a focus on results. I think the inputs and the structure that John is putting in are having initial beneficial impact, and I hope that they have more. A particular result I think we need is a return to more civil discourse of the type that I often have with Andy. And I hope that we can get back to that. And whether that's a function of medium, that is to say tweets, whether that's a function of lack of trust in the institutions that govern this country, or whether that's another symptom of how we conduct our business, how we get news, how we interact with one another. I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know it's incumbent, or I put it this way, particularly in light of what's happening in Washington. I think there's a great responsibility on all of us to do our part to try to return civil discourse. I've seen it here. I've been really happy to be part of it. I always see it when I get a chance to be with Andy, which I think is reaffirmation of what has made this country what it has been for so long.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have a few students come up on stage and join the conversation. They'll come up as I introduce them. First, Sobia Mostonshava is a master's student at the Keough School of Global Affairs, International Peace Studies program, and a Fulbright scholar. She's from Tajikistan and has 8 years of experience with gender and youth programming. We also have Stephen Pete Freeman. I feel like this is a beauty contest. He's a senior from Noblesville, Indiana, majoring in sociology, gender studies, and international peace studies. He has visited Ghana 5 times for work in women's and adolescent health and education, and studied abroad in Rwanda as a Gilman International Scholar. Welcome, Pete. Kelly Smith, she's a senior from Pittsburgh, Kansas, majoring in history with a concentration in 20th century Europe. She's a member of Kellogg's International Scholars Program. After graduation, she plans on working in the nonprofit sector before pursuing a career in public policy. And Flora Tang, she's a senior majoring in political science and theology. She's from Beijing, China, and is a research assistant for the Kellogg Institute for International Studies and an anchor intern at the Notre Dame campus ministry. Thank you all for joining us. I know you have some very tough questions for our guests. So we will begin with Sobia.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I would like to start with a question on U.S. foreign policy with regards to Afghanistan. President Trump's administration view of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan seems a departure from President Bush's and Obama's vision. What do you think about that? And the second part of my question is that China, Russia, and Pakistan are becoming more proactive in Afghanistan with a different view of Taliban's role in the peace process. How should U.S. foreign policy shape around these new developments?
Well, that's an excellent question. I just want to say to you what I've said to you and all your classmates is I'm so impressed by the team of, the cadre of students that have entered the Keough School this fall. One, I don't see in candor the president's announced policies as being as different from the status quo as either your question or the president's pronouncements, that is to say President Trump's pronouncements, suggest. We're talking about a relatively small amount of increase in troops on the ground. We're talking about no change in terms of the mission that the troops will be carrying out. And the biggest change is that he has gone back to a posture on the ground that says we'll stay as long as we need to change the conditions on the ground, rather than make our military presence in Afghanistan subjected to a timeline. So what I worry about in the policy is related partly to what your observation is with the other players in the region, but also then ultimately to what the Afghan government itself is prepared to do. The reason to have had the timeline that we had on during the Obama years on our presence in Afghanistan was to put pressure on the Afghan government to begin to reform itself so that it's in a position to take on more of the security responsibility itself. They've done that in very important ways. The Afghan counterterrorism forces are very effective, mostly because of the partnering they've been doing with American forces. I think that's a very important thing. Nevertheless, on issues of governance, corruption, respect for the rule of law, the Afghan government is not making enough progress. And as long as they continue to slow walk progress on those questions, we cannot, through either our military or diplomatic presence, ensure stability in that country if the government itself will not do those things. So I worry first and foremost about whether we're pressuring the Afghan government to take its role seriously. Secondly, the role of the other actors in the region. Russia has a very complicated history in Afghanistan, and it would not surprise me if they were acting cynically, but I don't think there is a long-term play where Afghans see partnership with Russia as in their interest. Their history is too tainted. China, with its Silk Road building west from Beijing, is interesting and need not be a threat to us. If China, as it's rising to be a world power, is taking on more responsibility for free trade, non-corrupt practices, economic growth, and they can do that in a way that promotes Afghan interests, that need not be a threat to us. We should keep the pressure on the Chinese to do that, but that shouldn't be a threat to us. What is and continues to be a threat to us, and President Trump did raise this, is Pakistan's continued tolerance of the Taliban fighting in Afghanistan and retreating to a safe haven in Pakistan. As long as they will permit the Taliban to have safe haven in Pakistan, it's going to be very difficult for Afghan forces to secure critical regions of Afghanistan. So we should continue to keep pressure on Pakistan to play its role, but we ought not get overly concerned, in my view, about the Chinese role in the region. And in all cases, we need to make sure that we're pushing more and more responsibility onto the Afghans themselves, because, you know, Andy's entire time in the government, save those first couple months, and my entire time in the government, we had well north of an average of 20 to 30,000 troops in Afghanistan. That's a long time and a lot of investment. And it's time, in my view, for the Afghans to take more control of their future.
Why don't we'll keep going with Pete so we can get into questions.
Mr. Card, Mr. McDonough, thank you both for speaking with us tonight. After 9/11, narratives about Muslims and Islam generally began to take on a fearful and hostile tone. Mr. Card, how did you work with President Bush to discourage Islamophobic narratives in the United States and limit their influence on policy while simultaneously launching the war on terror? And Mr. McDonough, in the Obama White House, how did concern about Islamophobia impact policy, and how would you compare this prejudicial fear today to what it was in the weeks and months following September 11th?
I'll start off by saying I had the privilege of meeting with some students earlier today and got a similar question from some of the students at Notre Dame. When 9/11 happened, we were kind of a schizophrenic people. We were very afraid, but we were very together. We rallied as a nation. We gave up our concerns and just went to help, and everybody wanted to help. We had huge numbers of people volunteering to join the military. At the same time, we were increasingly skeptical of our neighbors, and that was a challenge. And I remember President Bush used one word one time, and he felt bad about it as soon as he said it, but he said the word crusade. And we know how that word can be taken. And the president recognized that immediately, and he wanted to make sure that that wasn't the case. This was not a situation we were looking to condemn a religion, a great religion. And so we worked very hard to demonstrate that Islam has many good things in its faith. And the president actually went and visited a mosque. He brought imams to the White House. We demonstrated that this was not a campaign against Muslims, and he tried to overcome any bias that was created as a result of the attacks. It was a hard thing to do, but it took an awful lot of work on behalf of the president to give him a place to talk about it and to make sure that we address that. But it's critically important that we as a nation, and that all nations, Muslims nations especially, join to make sure that there is no safe haven for radical terrorists to take advantage of trying to create anarchy as they pursue a very selfish, narrow piece of their religion that doesn't reflect all of us. So a lot of work needs to be done, and it continues to need to be done, and we should be working very hard to make sure that the world sees us as not trying to drive a wedge between any faith. We are a nation that is almost unique to the world. We are a true melting pot in every sense of the word. And most other nations don't understand that. There are a handful that do, but most do not. And it's critical for us to demonstrate that we can be united as one people with many different colored faces and lots of different minds and lots of different passion, but we are standing together to make sure that all people are welcomed and none are excluded. So we don't want people driving us to exclude. And that's why we have to fight terrorism, because terrorists want to create terror. And we've got to demonstrate that they have no home here, and we don't want any other country to have it. So I don't know that there's a good answer, except it's an ever-present responsibility for every president, and quite frankly, it's a responsibility for every citizen to step up. And we know what's right. Every one of us has a conscience. Some of it may be guided through different faiths, but the conscience is kind of the same. The faith informs it in different ways, and we have to listen to our conscience.
Yeah. Look, President Obama often spoke of exactly this last point that Andy made, and I always admired very early in September 2001 when President Bush went to a local mosque in Washington, and what I thought was a very positive and powerful gesture. But a fundamental tenet of American strength, in my view, is exactly what Andy said, which is there is great strength in our diversity. And it's incumbent on all of us to protect that strength. And what do I think, Pete, about how we see Islamophobia now as compared to after 9/11? It's very difficult, but I am concerned, as I just said a minute ago, at the state of discourse in the country, period, to include efforts to divide us along religious or ethnic or political lines. And I think it's a mistake if we let anybody do that. And our history as a country shows us that it weakens us when we do that. And there's nothing more empowering than to see the pictures of Father Ted with Dr. King here on campus. And Notre Dame has taken a particular role in the country in serving as a conscience for that strength through diversity over time, and I have every confidence that you all will continue to do that.
Kelly.
Thank you for being here today. In the last few years, there's been a rise of nationalism in Europe, as demonstrated by events such as Brexit and increased support for populist parties like Alternative for Deutschland in Germany's recent election. How do you see these nationalistic attitudes impacting international organizations?
I'm very concerned about what I see, but I think there's a way to see this as either half full or half empty. The half full case says that after our election and after Brexit, that we may have seen the rise of the Nationalist Party to the presidency in France, that we were going to see even more gains from the AfD in Germany, and that we would have seen other gains by the right-wing parties in Europe in elections in places like the Netherlands. We haven't. And so as concerned as I am about the 14 or so % that the AfD got in Germany recently, I think the reaction to some of what we've seen in the last 8 to 10 months suggests that voters are taking a harder look, which is to say they didn't go as firmly for some of the more right-wing parties as we feared they might. Point one. Point two is that doesn't mean we don't face a real challenge, which is to say that there is increasing distrust in institutions of governance. That's as true here as it is in countries in Europe. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that we combat that distrust by ensuring that we're focused on performance and we're focused on opportunity, which are things that the American people had grown to expect of their governing institutions. Third, I'd say the reason I'm most hopeful, other than when I see places like Notre Dame and all of you students doing what you're doing, and the professors doing here what they're doing, is that we're on the verge of a pretty substantial technological revolution for the deployment of automation and artificial intelligence. We should lead the world in that. But we should also lead the world in that in ensuring that our people, our workers, are paired with those new machines, robotics, automation, to ensure that they have new opportunity to grow. Because right now people don't feel like they have those opportunities, so we should take advantage of what is a fundamental revolution to make sure that they do. It's going to be hard work. It's not easy, but it's never been easy in this country. So that's what we ought to do.
I see a pendulum is always swinging in the political world, no matter which country you're in. And I'm a witness to the pendulum having gone almost every direction, and I think there's a cycle to it. Yes, we have been in a cycle of frustration with central governments. And the United States election produced a result demonstrating a lot of people were very frustrated and what they wanted change. I don't think that that is foreign to what's been happening in Britain or in France, or in Germany, or in Japan. And so they're going through the similar frustration pendulum swinging that we are. I think it's actually one of the realities of a democracy. And when people want to speak out, and they speak out during campaigns, they're speaking out with kind of parochial concerns, and it's okay. Because the most important word in the Constitution is we, it's our government, and we led the world to recognize that a government of the people is best. And so when the people speak out, someone should be listening. They should exercise judgment and not just respond to an emotion, but exercise judgment. But there's frustration virtually in every country around the world about the government not paying to them. And I think that's manifested itself in some of the changes that are taking place. But it's actually kind of a good wake-up call. I just hope people heed the call and don't misread it.
And Flora.
Thank you both for being here today. So the United States has historically made balancing human rights and strategic realism a goal in its foreign policy. In your opinion, given the growing allegations of human rights violations by the State of Israel, such as its building of settlements in the West Bank and its movement restrictions of Palestinian citizens, what should the future trend of the United States foreign policy over Israel look like?
You're the foreign policy.
Okay.
He's a real expert on this stuff. I'm just a pretender.
Look, I think it's been U.S. policy for a long time across Republican and Democratic administrations to oppose settlements because issues of territory between Israelis and Palestinians are to be decided not by facts on the ground, but rather through negotiation. And we, in the Obama administration, as I believe Andy and the Bush administration team, made a priority to try to push the parties to the table to negotiate. That seems to me to be the only reasonable way to resolve competing claims on territory and on other matters in the region. And I believe it should continue to be American policy to insist on that. Everybody will tell you how difficult it is. I think we've both got the bruises and the scars to prove it. But the only thing that's more difficult to envision than a negotiated solution to the ongoing challenge between Israelis and Palestinians is trying to resolve it in some other way. And so I continue to hope that America makes that a priority. And I continue to believe that there are a majority Israelis and a majority of Palestinians who feel the same way. And if we lower the bar on them or make it easier on them to not seek to resolve it peacefully, then I think we'll be surrendering our traditional role in the region. Same is true on maintaining a high bar on human rights, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. And I think we've seen this as you suggested, a fundamental tenet of American foreign policy across Republican and Democratic administrations. It's what the world expects of us, and if we don't live up to it, then we're letting the world down, but we're also walking away from a tradition here that's been a defining part of American foreign policy for as long as I can remember.
I think, first of all, Israel is the most viable democracy in the Middle East. And America should be standing with Israel and defend that democracy. And I think that's very, very important. Having said that, the climate under which Israel invites a solution to the problem is critically important to create so that Israel has the permission to do what they have to do to find a broader solution. And that's not an easy thing to do. I think the closest we came to it was when Secretary of State James A. Baker III helped manage a Madrid peace process during the only term of President George H.W. Bush. I think if there had been a second term, that Madrid process might have produced other results. I can tell you, I was in the Oval Office when Ariel Sharon came to meet with President George W. Bush, and it wasn't the first time they had met, because Governor Bush had actually gone to Israel and flew in a helicopter with General Sharon over Israel to see how vulnerable Israel was to its neighbors. Very small country. And I know that Governor Bush was struck by how vulnerable the country looks. Now, yes, his partner on this trip in this helicopter was an old tank pilot or tank driver, Ariel Sharon, who had fought in the fields and made a difference and was a real hero. But when Prime Minister Sharon came to the United States and met with President Bush the very first time in the Oval Office, the meeting started off a little bit strident. And I remember President Bush interrupting the meeting and saying to Prime Minister Sharon, "Are you interested in peace? Because if you are, I am your partner. If you're not, it's going to be hard to find peace." It was a very blunt conversation. And Prime Minister Sharon said, "I am a partner for peace." And President Bush took that very seriously and got very engaged in trying to create a climate for peace. It wasn't easy, because this was when walls were going up and neighborhoods were being divided and land was being taken. And they did make progress. But then Prime Minister Sharon got very sick and he left office. So I do think there is a potential for success in Israel and dealing with its neighbors. I pray that President Trump's team will be a partner in that process. But it takes a real partner on the part of the Israelis to find the courage to make changes. I think it was relatively easy for Sharon to be a surprising partner because he had been a general. It's a little more difficult when you have prime ministers who haven't been battling on the field. But I think that's the way to come to a solution, but we should all pray for it. And I think as people of faith, we should be praying for that part of the world to find common ground, and I'm confident that we can. But I don't think there's an easy solution. There has never been an easy solution when dealing with what should happen in Jerusalem.
Well, I want to thank our panel of students, and we'll be opening up for questions at the microphones, but thank you all very much for joining us up here.
Good job.
Hi, my name is Patrick Calderon, and I am a Master of Global Affairs student in the new Keough School of Global Affairs. My question has to do with trade. I come from Canada, a country that is heavily reliant on trade with the United States. NAFTA enjoys widespread popularity in Canada, but its popularity and the popularity of other trade agreements is waning in the US as concerns mount over whether trade agreements have adverse effects on American workers. I want to get your thoughts on the prospect of NAFTA renegotiation, and I would also like to ask what the best way is of protecting American workers while also engaging international trade agreements. Thank you.
I worked for the first President Bush who started the NAFTA negotiations. I was very supportive of President Clinton when he signed and came to an agreement that was called NAFTA. And I've been an advocate for NAFTA and what it has done for the United States economy, for the Canadian economy, and for the Mexican economy. In full disclosure, I am also on the board of directors of Union Pacific Railroad, and they help serve the Mexican market and are an interface down there. So I have passion about it. I think it's the right thing to do. I do think that it's credible that NAFTA be tweaked in the process. So I'm hoping that what President Trump is looking to do is not dismantle NAFTA, but address some of the credible concerns that have been raised as we've seen how it has been implemented and working. And so I'm hoping everybody is taking this opportunity to renegotiate NAFTA seriously. I suspect they are. I know the meetings in DC. The first meeting, I think, was a little bit procedural. I think the second meeting got into some substance. If you come to the table with good faith, you can find solutions that won't require the agreement to be scrapped. You maybe can find a way for the agreement to be better for all parties, and I'm hoping that can happen. But I would like not to see us create a climate where we are eliminating the wonderful market that has grown for all of the people of North America. And, you know, the United States had a relationship with Canada before NAFTA. And that gave fuel to the need to have a North American free trade agreement. And I don't want to see what was there before NAFTA jeopardized because of what is happening after NAFTA. And so that's where I come from.
I can't agree more with that. I think that NAFTA has exceeded expectations in terms of trade growth among the three countries. Nevertheless, it has become a symbol for people who are suspicious of trade agreements. So I think Andy's point about coming to the table in good faith is the right one. But I think this too, like my earlier comments, when you ask what's our best way to ensure that we can maintain support for trade, is I think we have to be serious about ensuring that there is opportunity in Canada, the United States, and Mexico for opportunity for access to higher paying jobs. There's no doubt that wages have been soft in our country for now an extended period. There's no question, as Andy said, that there's waning support or continued concern about whether government institutions are performing. And I think those two things are related. So we have to get more serious about job training. We got to get more serious about a skills-based economy and labor market where people with skills, irrespective of their training, can get open jobs. That's going to require us to get more serious about job training. And if we do, then that coupled with a good set of tweaks on NAFTA can improve the relationship with Canada. And in all cases, we ought not go back to something worse than the status quo before NAFTA. And I think people of good faith can do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My name is Nadoz Yenikuru. I'm Patrick's classmate, and I'm from Nigeria. My question is in Catholicism and going global. So Catholicism has an influential role in the world, and it's a strong aspect of Notre Dame's identity. In your view, what is the promise and challenge of this aspect of the university's global engagement?
I'll take this as the Catholic, Andy. Look, I mean, in a lot of ways, the Catholic Church is the first multinational. It's got reach across the world and has been, in countless cases, a symbol for renewed opportunity through education and growth for people not only here in Indiana, but across this country and then across the world. So I don't see an ability to get our hands around globalization in the way that Dean Appleby suggested we need to in his earlier remarks without the Catholic Church and other institutions of faith maintaining a very powerful engagement in questions of public policy and questions of the common good, because it's precisely the church teaching and the belief in the dignity of every individual human made in the image of God that will get us refocused on a globalization that means increased opportunity for everybody, and will get us focused on a series of policy decisions around the dramatic expansion of inequality between rich and poor. And so not only do I think that the church's involvement and Notre Dame's involvement in going global as we try to adjust or understand globalization is promising, I believe also that absent a role for the Catholic Church in this important debate, we can't get to the kind of outcome that we need.
I'm a man of faith, but I don't practice faith the way the Roman Catholics do. My wife is a minister. She's a Methodist minister, so faith is very, very important to me. And I think it's critically important in the ability for anyone to serve in government. I can't imagine being a chief of staff and not being grounded in faith. I can't imagine a president making tough decisions without being grounded in faith. I think the church, the Catholic Church in particular, because they are everywhere, has a particular responsibility to create a climate of justice and to be engaged. I'm a witness to how the missionary work of the Catholic Church has transformed, yes, individuals, but more significantly, peoples. And I just don't want the Catholic Church to run away from the world. I want them to embrace the world and be in it. And my wife wrote a book called Pray, Act, Pray Again, emphasis on the word act. And I think the Catholic Church does act, and it creates a climate of inclusion that causes people to recognize there is a greater good to do rather than a selfish good to take advantage of. And in far too many places around the world, the great cancer of distrust is one of corruption.
Amen.
And if you can help to create a climate where people don't feel they have to take advantage of other people, you're making a big contribution to the world, and you're serving justice. So yes, I hope the church will continue to be very actively engaged, especially by supporting institutions like Notre Dame and sending students from Notre Dame and graduates from Notre Dame around the world to help educate others to the opportunities that come by practicing your faith and contributing to society.
Here, here. Amen.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that.
Just want to let people know there's another microphone on this side. We will be going a little bit longer and probably fit in a few other questions. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Thank you both for being here. My name is Pratham Janeja. I'm a junior studying political science and computer science, and I was born and raised in Edison, New Jersey. My question is specifically towards you, Mr. McDonough. Given the consensus amongst United States intelligence agencies that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election, whether through its attacks on social media or through the now targeting of 21 states' voting machines, I'm curious as to what you think the implications of these actions are in terms of cybersecurity and national security at large. Specifically, around this time last year, when the information about Russia's interference became public, what were the conversations in the White House regarding potential retaliation, but also setting some sort of a threshold for determining a cyber attack an act of war?
So it's obviously an ongoing debate in the country as we get to learn more and more, and I think that the Congress is doing the country a favor by continuing to look into this matter and identifying and pulling forward more evidence about what the Russians did and what they intended to do. So I have a couple things I think to say about this. One is the intelligence community made an announcement just about a year ago about the Russian intent to try to influence our election. I think it's important for us to recognize that the intelligence community was spot on, and they got it just right. That is to say that the Russians did make a concerted effort to influence the outcome of our election. Number two, I think that we've also seen since then, according to press reports, efforts by the Russians to influence democratic elections in other democracies, to include in France. So the second point is we ought to be on guard for this happening again. Three, that means that we as individuals have to be very careful about our own cyber hygiene, how we operate in cyberspace. We have to, as leaders of organizations, be very careful about increasing cyber protections for our workers, for our people, for our families, because this is going to happen again. They've demonstrated intent, they've demonstrated capability, and they'll come back at it again. Fourth, that means that we also have to get more serious and more discerning about the kind of information we consume and what we pass on. What we now know, judging from reports in the press over the last couple of days, is that Russian intelligence, people associated with Russian intelligence, it appears, were actively using our social media sites to propagate false news, false stories. And we have to make sure, as consumers of that information, that we're more discerning in what we consume. Lastly, I think it was important in terms of this question of retaliation that we establish very clearly for the record what happened. We did that last January in publishing what we knew had happened at that time, both because we thought it was important to give over to Congress everything that we knew had happened so they could continue to investigate what happened, but also so we could warn our friends, including in places like France, that Russians had intent, and we could show them how they did it, at least in our system, so that they were in a better position to defend themselves. We also thought it was important to, as you said, ensure that Russia paid a price for the actions that it took, both in our identifying publicly what they were doing, but also then in a series of sanctions and in a series of diplomatic actions to underscore that this type of behavior is not consistent with a role of a country in good standing in the international system. Bottom line is, I think we're in a new era in our ongoing competition with the Russians, but also in the conduct of our democratic elections. And it's incumbent on us as voters, as citizens in this system, to be more discerning in consuming the information that comes before us, what we forward, what we post on our news feeds, so that we don't fall prey to somebody who would want to do our most fundamental democratic institutions harm, and in so doing, weaken us as a country.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can get in a few more before we have to wrap up, please.
Hello, thank you for being here and talking with us today. My name is Chista Karamati, and I'm studying Master of Global Affairs at Keough School. I'm asking my question of you, Mr. McDonough. In 2009, Obama called for, quote unquote, the security of a world without nuclear weapons. In 2016, he unveiled a $1 trillion plan to modernize US nuclear weapons. What happened? Some suggest Crimea, but surely there is more to it than this. What else?
Good question. What the president announced when he was in Prague in the speech that you quoted from in 2009 is an effort to work with the Russians at the time in negotiations with President Medvedev for coordinated reductions in our nuclear forces. That was eventually, we eventually reached an agreement which was signed and ratified by our Senate in what was called the START Treaty, which led to verifiable reductions in their nuclear arsenal and ours. we thought it was very important to underscore the bargain at the heart of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is signed many decades ago, which said even those countries that today have nuclear weapons are pledged to get rid of those nuclear weapons so that we can get to a world without nuclear weapons. That proliferation treaty has been a resounding success, inasmuch as the nuclear club has remained relatively stable since that deal was signed. And it's signed with a fundamental agreement at the heart of it, which said, if you don't have nuclear weapons now, don't get them. Because if you do, you'll be subject to sanction and opprobrium from the international community. If you do have nuclear weapons now, commit to getting rid of them so that the guys who don't have them need not have them. It's been United States policy for as long as there's been the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to envision a world where we don't have nuclear weapons, but to maintain them in effective status until we've reached a point where we don't need them. So not only was the 2009 statement consistent with our policies, and that statement also then helped us reach an important nuclear agreement with the Iranians, which over the weekend Secretary Mattis and General Dunford have again affirmed continues to stop the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons. But so was the decision in 2016 to invest in our existing stockpile to maintain its efficacy for as long as our opponents and our enemies, including Russia, have a nuclear arsenal, we will maintain ours. But our commitment to a world without nuclear weapons remains. So this, like so much of the other topics we've discussed tonight, is going to remain a difficult challenge. But absent a continued commitment to this agreement at the heart of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we risk seeing the proliferation of more of these terrible weapons. So we have to make sure that we're continuing out both of these tracks.
Thank you.
And I am getting the high sign, so this is going to be our last question, and it can be really, really short. I'm sorry, I'm going to be in trouble. One of you, oh, now you're going to have to decide between the two of you. That's terrible.
Okay, I'm going to do something that's unexpected. This young lady really wants her question asked. So first of all, I'm just going to mention, real quick, the same Marilyn Keough, that's part of the Keough Institute in the school. I'm a resident of Keough Hall, so go Roos. Anyway, here's your question.
So nice. Israel passed a family reunification law in 2003 banning family reunification. This law violates the constitutional right of Israelis to equality and to family life, including the right to live with a foreign spouse in Israel. I am a Palestinian Christian from the little town of Bethlehem, and Israel bans me from marrying an Israeli Christian from Nazareth. How can you argue that Israel is a democracy in light of this law? Also, how can the American government help American citizens with Arab or Palestinian origins have the right to life and family reunification? I mean, in this day and age, having a law that dictates who you marry is absurd. Also, if this was the case back in Jesus' time, what would Mary and Joseph do?
Father John.
Like, there are a range of very difficult questions at the heart of this conflict, and we've already discussed several over the course of the last couple of days. And each of them is extraordinarily difficult. And there's no reason that our commitment to the defense of Israel, which Andy rightly said is a vibrant democracy, means that we affirm each of the laws that the Israeli Parliament passes. I'm not familiar with this one, but there's no reason for me to doubt the veracity of what you're saying. But what I do believe, and what I stated earlier, is that the only way to resolve these very nettlesome issues between the parties in the region is through peaceful negotiation at the table. And that we as the United States have continually espoused that position, and we have continually espoused our fundamental belief in the dignity of people on both sides of the conflict. And the quicker we get to that, the quicker we can resolve the fundamental injustices that we see experienced every day on the ground, in Israel proper, in the territories. And until we can get to that point, we should, as a government, continue to push for that resolution. And that's what we've done, Republicans and Democrats, for a long time, and I associate myself with Andy's remarks before, which is he hopes that the Trump administration continues that tradition. So,
the reality of democracy is it's not perfect. And today, literally today, October 4th, in 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. You probably don't know what the 14th Amendment to the Constitution did, but it allowed African American men to vote. It was 1920 before the Constitution was amended to allow women to vote. So our democracy is still not perfect. The democracy in Israel is not perfect, but we're on a better path to perfection than others. And I think that's what we want to work toward, and that's what we have to do as a nation, and I celebrate it, but you've raised some tough questions and they need answers. I'm not sure that we're competent to give you viable answers. We can have aspirations, but I don't know what the right answer is.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And before I give the stage back to Father John, I just have a very quick announcement. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, right across the hall from here, in the DCO Theater, is an event by the Keough School called What Can You Expect from the Keough School? And we'll have international and national guests on a panel, including Mayor Pete. And it's a chance for you to have some refreshments and learn more about the Keough School, so we hope to see you there. And I'll let Father John conclude our forum.
I think you agree with me. We are just extraordinarily fortunate to listen to these two public servants who have served our leaders so well. And I just want you to join me in thanking Andy and Dennis for this extraordinary evening of reflection. A couple of tokens to show our appreciation for their being here. It is the inaugural year of the Keough School of Global Studies. We're celebrating that, but we're also celebrating the 175th anniversary of the university. For each of you, a little photo book of the 175 years of this university. You have served, Dennis and Andy, you have served respectively the 43rd and 44th presidents of the United States. We want something that acknowledges that tremendous service you have given, and also reminds you a bit of your visit to Notre Dame and reminds you of our esteem for you. So I give you each a very important gift.
very good.
Very nice.
Very good. Thank you so much. Awesome.
That was a great discussion.
Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. It's awesome. My kids are going to be jealous. Yes.